Hey everybody. So, one of the downfalls of the fact that I work full time, like outside the home, is that I'm not able to comment on everything that I'd like to comment on. But the positive side of that is that I don't end up doing a lot of hot takes that I end up regretting later. Pretty much all of my takes are at least a few days old. So, this is a really cold take. This is from all the way back last week, but it's on an issue that people asked me to comment on last week. So, after a few days of reflecting on it, I still think it's one of the dumber things that Trump has done, which means it's perfectly targeted to that certain part of his base, the pseudo Christian mega base that are just going to eagerly lap up every morsel of this. So, Trump formed a task force the other day to root out anti Christian bias in the government. And I made myself listen to him talk about it so you wouldn't have to. And I'll admit, I fell into a little bit of a stupor pretty quickly. But what I got out of it is that apparently America used to be this fantastic Christian country. But then something happened where we couldn't say Merry Christmas anymore. So in 2016, God elected Trump so he could bring religion back. So we became this fantastic, one might even say great Christian country again. But then, for 4 years under Joe Biden, I guess Christianity suffered like it's never suffered before. And it sounds like it might have almost died even. And then it gets hazy here, but apparently God needed Trump to make Christianity great again in America. So, anyway, that's all to say Merry belated Christmas. I would have said it sooner, but I didn't realize until now that Trump had re decriminalized saying it. So, anyway, in other words, I learned nothing by listening to Trump talk about it, and I lost about 3.5 points of IQ in the process. But yeah, I guess he's forming an anti Christian bias task force, and he's putting Pam Bondi, his personal attorney general, in charge of that task force. Now, Pam Bondi is a Christian. I can tell because she wears a cross around her neck. But she's not nearly as good of a Christian as that woman who does his propaganda conferences. That woman's cross is at least 3 times bigger than Pam Bondi's. So I guess I'm kind of irritated that he'd pick someone with such a small cross to head up something so hugely important to Christians. But anyway, the best thing that I can say about this anti Christian bias task force is that I assume it's going to protect my right to continue to say things like this. As a Christian, I find Trump's fraudulent appeals to the Christian faith to be nauseating and offensive and patently absurd. And I hope that I'm coming across with the right level of disrespect. Sometimes I worry that my disrespect might not be coming through. So I hope that's coming through here. But as a white, straight male Christian in America, I just have to say honestly, I've never personally experienced even the mildest sort of persecution for my faith. But Trump did talk this week about some examples of what he called anti Christian bias under the Biden administration. And as I heard those examples, it did remind me of why I do still believe that a lot of his supporters are sincere Christians, but they're being misled. His language is so deceptive for people who want to believe him. And I'm not letting those people off the hook, don't get me wrong, but I can see how the deception works. I went on the Christian Post to read what they had to say about all of this, and it kind of put me into a little bit of a depression for a couple hours. I think a lot of sincere Christians read that stuff. And if that's all they're reading, then I'm not surprised that they're falling for Trump's act. Like when someone consumes that stuff, the things that Trump says just sort of fit with this twisted worldview that they're hearing every day in other sources. So I don't exactly blame people for believing his stuff, given the information they're taking in. What I blame them for is wanting to believe his stuff and choosing to only take in information that affirms what they want to believe. I think a lot of very unpersecuted people want to believe that they're part of a group that's being persecuted. So they listen to Fox News or they read the Christian Post or whatever, and they hear things that reaffirm their beliefs. So I'm not judging the sincerity of their faith necessarily. I'm judging their long term decision to soften up their minds to receive the kind of stuff that Trump is shoveling. So, this anti Christian bias stuff is just another example of that. Now, I know that one of the cases these people cite has to do with the FBI investigating a guy who was planning violence and who claimed to be a militant type of Catholic. And so it sounds like the FBI was pretty sloppy in some of its procedures around that case. And they investigated themselves internally afterwards, and they held some people accountable for the sloppiness around it. But in no way were they involved in a concerted effort against Catholics. They had a violent guy who was talking openly about being part of a militant Catholic sect, and they investigated to see if there might be a larger concern that they needed to know about. Now, I understand and appreciate why we want our government to be very careful about how they investigate religious movements. As someone who's operating in the realm of religion and politics myself, I hope that they're serious about continuing to honor the protections around religious and political speech. But here's just something to chew on. An awful lot of the most dangerous militia movements in the country claim to have some religious basis for their beliefs. So, do we just rule out investigating any movement that slaps the Christian label on themselves? That seems like a pretty obvious cheat code if we let people get away with that. I mean, if we allow that, then what's next? Are we going to just like pardon people who attacked the Capitol and beat up cops and glorify the weird little choir that they put together in prison? Wait, never mind. So, for sure, we do need to be careful and we need to protect freedom of religion in this country, but let's not fall for some of this like insipid reasoning that some very dishonest people are using to win over sincere people of faith. So, Trump also talked in his speech about a 75-year-old woman who was arrested for praying. And he said, for example, most of us would not have believed it possible that a grandmother with a severe medical condition, quite elderly woman, would be put in jail for praying here in America. She was put in jail because she was praying. But we're joined today by a woman who was 75 years old. Paulette Harlow was sentenced to 2 years in prison for peacefully praying outside of a clinic, charged under an obscure law that hadn't been used in years, selectively weaponized against Christians by the previous administration. So, I just have to respond to this nonsense. First of all, I shouldn't have to say this, but I've got nothing against 75-year-old women, and I've got nothing against them praying. But that's not what happened. According to the Justice Department statement on this matter, according to the evidence, on October 22nd, 2020, the co-conspirators, including Paula Harlow, among others, forcefully entered the clinic and set about blockading 2 clinic doors using their bodies, furniture, chains, and ropes. Once the blockade was established, they live streamed their activities. The evidence also showed that the defendants violated the FACE Act by using a physical obstruction to injure, intimidate, and interfere with the clinic's employees and a patient because they were providing or obtaining reproductive health services. Now, I say this as someone who was active in the pro-life movement in the late 80s and the early 90s. What Paulette Harlow did was a choice that she made, knowing the consequences. She wasn't arrested for praying outside of a clinic. She was arrested for choosing to go much further than that with several other people. Trump said most of us would not have believed it possible that a grandmother with a severe medical condition, quite elderly woman, would be put in jail for praying. I think most of us would not have believed it possible that a grandmother with a severe medical condition would break into a clinic and chain herself to a bunch of other people, but there you go. So here's my point. Whatever you think about what she did, whether you agree with her cause or not, in no way did she suffer anti-Christian bias. If we want to put what she did in the best light, we can call it civil disobedience. Okay, good for her. She believed strongly in a cause, and she put her very body on the line to stand up for that cause. But a key point about civil disobedience is that you're willing to suffer the consequences to shed light on that cause. So, for example, the other day, Chris Kluwe, a former NFL punter and more importantly, a former Minnesota Viking, got arrested for committing an act of civil disobedience at a city council meeting in Huntington Beach, California. He was drawing attention to his opposition to the MAGA movement, and he announced that he was going to commit an act of civil disobedience. And he went to jail. And then when he got out of jail, he continued speaking out against Trump. Now, my understanding is that Chris Kluwe is an agnostic. What I haven't heard from anyone is an outcry against the anti agnostic bias of the Huntington Beach Police Department. And I suppose I could ask my agnostic friends what they think of the whole situation, but I'm pretty sure they'd just tell me they don't know. But really, why isn't anyone claiming that Chris Kluwe's arrest is due to anti agnostic bias? Because that would be stupid. And it's no less stupid to equate the arrest of someone who happens to be a Christian to anti Christian bias. The whole point of doing civil disobedience is to bring attention to your cause. In the case of this 75-year-old woman, she was bringing attention to her pro life cause. And she knew the serious consequences of breaking the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. I remember when that act went into effect under Bill Clinton, because at that time I was volunteering as a speaker for a pro-life group in Minnesota. And I'd go into schools and churches and I'd make an appeal about the sanctity of human life. And the organization that I volunteered for took the FACE Act very seriously. We weren't doing any of that direct action stuff anyway. That wasn't what we were doing. But we were told in no uncertain terms that if we did, we could not volunteer for this organization because that act had teeth in it. And we'd be opening our organization up to severe penalties if we did that sort of thing. And I remember at the time not thinking that the act was fair, but I knew the consequences for breaking it. And all these years later, I guarantee that this woman knew the consequences for her actions. So whether you consider her a villain or a hero, my point is the same. She didn't experience anti-Christian bias. She experienced the consequences of a willing act of disobedience. Her Christian faith might have motivated her to do the civil disobedience, but she wasn't being punished for being a Christian. I'm sort of in the mood to beat this dead horse, so I'm just going to go on here and say that let's say she believes that it's sinful to drink alcohol. So she goes into a liquor store and she starts smashing bottles around. It may have been her Christian convictions that led her to do the vandalism, but she's not experiencing anti-Christian bias when the cops come and arrest her for doing that. It doesn't protect the Christian faith when we single it out like this and ask for special privileges in the culture. And that's what this is. If Black Lives Matter protesters get arrested for chaining themselves to the doors of a police station, for instance, it doesn't matter whether they're motivated by their Christian faith or some other worldview. They're arrested for trespassing or whatever the charge is. That's civil disobedience. That's how it works. You do the crime and you do the time or pay the fine or whatever. And that's what's powerful about it. You sacrificed something in order to bring attention to your cause. If you try to turn it into something else later and then whine about being persecuted for your faith, it's just not being honest. So here's the core of the problem. We live in a multicultural constitutional democracy, for now at least, and I rather like that. I don't expect the rest of the country to live by my beliefs. I understand the pro-life issue. To my mind, it's more morally complicated than my example of smashing liquor bottles because a person disapproves of alcohol. I've spent years trying to come to terms with that issue myself, and you can find several videos where I've wrestled with that issue out loud, and I wrote honestly about it in both of my books. So I understand why a person would do civil disobedience to draw attention to that issue or to any number of other issues. As long as your civil disobedience is nonviolent, then that sort of action has a noble place in American history. But can we stop with the stupidity? Can we stop falling for the red meat that these right-wing people are with crosses around their necks are throwing at us to win our support. If white Christians in America actually do start to experience persecutions, that'll be the first sign in a long time that we're starting to live for Jesus instead of being a reliable voting bloc for the most powerful, wealthy, and unrighteous interests in the country. And trust me, if we start living for Jesus instead of living for unrighteous power and wealth, we can't expect any help from Donald Trump's anti-Christian bias task force, no matter how big of a cross we wear around our necks. So thanks for listening.